Thanks for showing up on a 3-day weekend for the rest of the world. Of course, a scout would never be taking a day off at the end of May. Things are getting really busy in the wide world of baseball scouting. Lots of news going on. People are starting to post mock drafts and just lots of rumors and good stuff, all related to the upcoming draft, which is going to actually take place while some of us will be in Chicago. Okay, it's on Sunday and Monday, and it's abbreviated from what it had been, and so it'll all be on MLB Network. So that's exciting as well. So thanks for joining us here with Paul Scimonelli, who has done his second biography, and this is a masterpiece. I just have to say.
Really?
I think it's fabulous. I think that you're really gifted in terms of working in all the ancillary things going on besides just who he signed and newspaper clippings and kind of telling the chronological story. You put everything in context, and boy, was that an exciting time in the 30s and 40s. And what a character. I think he's unique in not just baseball history, but all of American history. A true patriot, wanted to give people opportunity. He was an immigrant himself and lived the American dream, I would say, and is widely reported as signing 400 ball players for the Washington Senators. We don't know. We may have 100 names. I expect to be able to identify a whole lot more when we go through the systematically. We're going to go through all 100,000 of the Weiss questionnaires once they become available on the SABR website. Mm-hmm. And so that's coming up soon. But Paul, tell us how it was that you found yourself a Washington Senators fan, lifelong. You wrote a great bio for a very unsung Washington Senators star, and then was kind of up in the air where to go next. How did you come to the subject of, because it's something of a niche, esoteric, niche kind of history that we in this committee choose to study, and that's scouting history. Mm-hmm. And I'm sure you learned a lot, but how was it that you came upon Papa Joe Cambria as the subject for your next biography?
Well, after I finished my Roy Sievers biography, I was looking for some kind of idea. So I wanted to stay with the Senators, and I always say, write about what you love, write about what you know. And I wanted to do, like a history of the 50s Senators, which was the era that I grew up listening to them on the radio between I'd say about 1956, 57, until they left in 61. And then, I listened to, the second edition of the Senators on radio and stuff of that nature. So I went to Gary Mitchum at McFarland, and I said, I've got this idea. And he said, how editors go, they go like this. Who's going to want to read a story of a bunch of losers except Washington Senators fans? So he suggested Joe Cambria. He actually made a suggestion of doing Cambria. And I knew very little about him. From the research that I did for the Roy Sievers book, I did know who he was. I didn't realize just how impressive and important he was until I started going down the rabbit holes that I went with. And that's the reason why the book is really kind of thick. It just seemed every time I would go somewhere and I'd come to a point in the book, there'd be an ancillary left-hand turn, and I'd say, "Oh, that's really interesting. I got to find that out." And so I kept going and digging and digging and digging, and the book just continued to grow and grow and grow, and it got it got really big. This is the biggest. It's almost twice as long as the Sievers book, and it's over 300 pages. So they were happy with it. It's got a lot of content and a lot of notes, and they edited the hell out of me. I was edited 5 times before they published the book, and I also had my own personal friend and a friend of mine who's a freelance editor for Ronan Littlefield, and he went through it as well. So he did jots and tittles and punctuation, and then it was peer reviewed and a bunch of other things. So it's just really an incredible journey. And what I tried to do, exactly what you said, is exactly what I tried to get away from. It's an obtuse subject. Only us guys here are going to know it, pretty much. Okay, I can see Jason smiling over there, because my usual spiel when I talk to crowds, I always tell them, do you know who Tom Greenwade is? Do you know who Cy Slapnik is? And everyone's going to say, who? Well, I can't say that here because everybody knows who Tom Greenwade was. He's the guy who found Mickey Mantle. And so, trying to explain the importance of scouts, how they are the backbone of the industry, is difficult to normal people who only really know their heroes. So it's kind of a hard sell when you're talking to people, but I have sold some books, so it's been pretty good. Where would you like me to go, Rod?
You're doing great. So, have at it.
Well, I think I'd like to do something different this time. If you've got any questions, let's start giving them to me now, as opposed to, a regular go through the spiel lecture and the PowerPoint kind of stuff. Is there something in particular that you might want to know about as far as Cambria is concerned? And then I can fill in some things as we go along. So I'd like to get everyone involved if you want to get involved.
Well, chronologically, okay, he's an immigrant from Italy, came over. Apparently his mother passed away, and the father brings. Was it just he and his brother?
No. He came over in 1893 with the brothers, and then the mother came later.
Oh, she did.
And from my research, the mother died here in this country, according to census records that I found. She died just a little while, when they came here, maybe possibly the turn of the century. Wasn't able to figure out exactly the date of her death, but they came over right before the 1890s. He was 2 or 3 by the time he came over on the boat. They settled in Massachusetts. Evidently, the father had connections there, and it's odd because they didn't settle in the North End where all the Italians were. He settled actually south of Boston in Roxbury, which is kind of like, what can I say? If you're familiar with the Washington Beltway, it'd be like Greenbelt. It's kind of like down southeast, southwest a little bit from where Boston is. So, he actually grew up in suburban Boston. It was not like in Boston town center, Medwick and Roxbury, around that area. And that's where he grew up, went to school, and started playing sandlot baseball and semi-pro ball. He played in the Medford leagues. He played in Newport. He then went to the Berlin Green Sox in Ontario, Canada, and he played there from 1911 to about 1912, and that's where he broke his leg. Supposedly from the Bino Rosinski, a wonderful researcher from the Canadian SABR people. He's the one who gave me a lot of information on Joe Cambria, and he showed me the clippings where they said that he had slid in the bank and twisted his ankle. But didn't twist his ankle. He was on crutches and he broke his leg, and so it put him out of baseball because I'm sure, as you know, in those days, you break something, there's no way of getting it back, and there's no rehab, and so he went out of baseball after that. Anybody got any questions so far?
I mean, I just want to say, I mean, I'm a Senators fan. That's one of the reasons why I'm here. More of the expansion Senators. That was when I was growing up. But I don't know. I mean, but before I got the announcement for this, you know, I knew that the original Nats were quite adept at recruiting Cuban players in the late 40s and 50s. I didn't know who did it. I didn't know anything about the guy, no facts, figures, and I haven't had a chance, unfortunately, to read the book or see the YouTube yet. So just basic, like sort of continue with the basic kind of facts and figures. You know, how did he get connected with Clark Griffith, I guess, or Calvin Griffith, and what, you know, just interested in how that all evolved.
Okay. Well, then I'll keep going along, and stop me when you got something. After he broke his leg, he went back to Lowell, Massachusetts, and got married about 1915. And he found out from a friend about a laundry business in Baltimore, and so he went to Baltimore approximately 1918, 1919, and bought a linen supply company called the Bugle Coat and Apron Supply Company, and he started that business. He was a laundryman, and he really had no practical baseball experience, and he just loved everything baseball so much that one of the first things that he did is, well, everybody did in all kinds of major hubs around the area. Everybody started a baseball team. Everybody had a baseball team, and there was sandlot leagues all over Baltimore. There were 150 leagues, not teams, 150 leagues in Baltimore in the 1920s and 30s. Huge amounts of baseball being played. And so he had a team, and he got uniforms, and it had, you know, bugle coat and apron on the back of it. So he had, you know, free advertisement wherever he went to. But the team got pretty good, and they started attracting some pretty decent semi-pro players. He then bought a baseball field, an old baseball field on the northeast side of Baltimore City. If you're right here in the middle of the city, it'd be like sort of off of that way, about a mile and a half outside of the city limits. Probably be about where Caton is, I guess. Might be that kind of area if you're from the Washington area. But anyway, it was just suburban. And so he bought a baseball field, and I just got to bring this up. You guys are going to be crazy about Cambria. From the time he started in Baltimore with the Bugle baseball team, and going along, he just didn't stop. He bought the baseball field in 28. From 1928 to 1938, until he sold the baseball field, he was a constant promoter. Not only did he have his baseball team, he promoted Negro League games. He promoted games between the House of David and his Bugle team. He promoted what they called Cuban teams. Everybody knows there was the Cuban ex-Giants, the Cuban Black Giants. That they call themselves Cuban, and you know why they call themselves Cubans, because they were trying to pass as you know, Americans, but they were black men, they were African Americans, and they were playing in these Cuban teams. So he would have those things. He promoted these huge all-star games between the Negro Leagues and his Bugle team, and then he would get all-star teams, all-star players also from the Baltimore Orioles of the International League, and he would make all-star games with all of them. Not only that, he promoted boxing, he promoted football, he promoted wrestling, he promoted high school soccer, high school lacrosse, and he even bought a boxing ring on Greenmont Avenue, and he bought a boxing ring and promoted boxing for a couple of years. He bought the Hagerstown Hubs in 1929, and that was Class D of the Blue Ridge League, and that's Hagerstown right up Route 40. He signed a whole bunch of kids off of the Sandlots, and from like Odenton and Jessup and Glen Burnie and places like that. And then he started his own system. He would have them on the Bugle team. He'd coach them up, and then he'd send them over to Hagerstown and coach them up. And some of them actually made it into the big leagues. In particular, one guy in particular from Odenton, his name was Babe Phelps. I don't know if that name rings a bell with anyone. Small-time player with a good career, 11-year career, lifetime batting average of 310, believe it or not. So he wasn't a fluke. He was a big guy, 6'2", 230, looked a little like Babe Ruth, was a left-handed swinger, swung from the left-hand side. And he made it to the Senators, and he made it to the Cubs, and he made it from 1931 till the war years. And then he went into the war, and then he didn't go back to baseball after the war. He decided he didn't want to go. In 1930, he had a basketball team, which he promoted. From 30 to 33, he was a boxing promoter. He was the first president of the Iceland Hockey League from 1931 to 32, and he tried to start a hockey team in Washington, D.C. in 1934, which didn't happen. He had the Baltimore Black Sox between 1932 and 1934. He bought the Albany Senators, which was a double-A team. He went from D-ball to double-A ball in 1933. No one had ever done that before, and the Sporting News that I looked up at that time, they said, this guy's crazy. He's a laundry man. He's never had any baseball experience, and he's going to make a double-A team. He's going to take on a double-A team. He actually made money. He actually made money during the Depression with a double-A team. And then he sold that team in 1936. And this I have to tell you about because Cambria was a smart businessman. He bought the team for around $7,500. He sold it to Horace Stoneman of the New York Giants because they wanted a minor league team for, it varies, between $60,000 and $70,000 is what he sold it for in 1936. In today's money, that's nearly $1 million for a double-A baseball team, and he made that money by selling the team and by selling some of his star players like Hack Wilson and Babe Phelps and things of that nature.
Yeah, but what I want to know is, did he hang on to the laundry business?
He held on to the laundry business. I'm sorry, it's a new tongue. I just bought it. Excuse me, I'm working it in. He held on to the laundry business until 1938.
Wow.
After the Salisbury Indians did so very well between 37 and 40.
That you need to pause there. The 37 Salisbury Indians are one of the more remarkable minor league stories in the history of baseball. And take a minute and explain what happened. This is the Eastern Shore League.
Yeah, the Eastern Shore League was just being recovered after the war. Right before the war and after the First World War and the Depression, and the ESL actually closed. And so Cambria was great for doing this. When he bought the Hagerstown Hubs, the Blue Ridge League had been dormant for a long time. So he goes and buys the Hubs, which is an absolutely nothing team, for absolutely no money, and he actually brings up attendance. And he brings up attendance well enough that he builds his own stadium. He did the same thing in Albany. Albany was a floundering thing that was in I don't think
on the field. This team was pretty remarkable, was it not?
The 37 Salisbury Indians were fantastic. He had two Cubans on the team, Mike Fermin Guerrera, who was a catcher and was also an interpreter, and he had another Cuban player, and they roomed together. His ace pitcher went 25-1 for the season. 25-1. What happened was they were 26-1 in the first week of June, and the next day, on Sunday, the day after they were 26-1, all of their wins were taken away because, according to minor league rules, you could only have what they call two class men on the team. A class man was someone who had played in a higher class division, so like maybe in AA or single A, and then had come down to a lower class to B or C league. And Salisbury was a D League team, I believe it was. Yeah, it was a D League team.
So they take away 26 wins.
They take away 26 wins. They were 0-1 in the middle of June, and the manager rallies the team, says, "I'm not going to bitch about it. This is what happens. This is what we're going to do," and kicked everybody's ass. And by Labor Day, they had won the ESL League division, and they won the championship both in 37 and in 38. And it was from there, from the ESL, Cambria saw Mickey Vernon playing for a Delaware team. And when the St. Louis Cardinals passed on him, he gobbled him up, and he signed him out of his ESL contract from the Delaware team that he was. So he actually found Mickey Vernon there, and they found Eddie Yost a few years later. So for all of you Senators fans, you'll remember those names in particular. The Salisbury Indians were a fantastic run.
Was that Landis that ruled that, or in the book? I think you say that somebody in the National Association, but that's pretty remarkable kind of disciplinary to strip a team off to a 26-1 start and just say, well, no, they're all losses.
No,
He had plenty of run-ins with Landis over the years.
This wasn't with Landis. This was with I'm trying to remember the commissioner of the minor league system.
Okay.
Grauman, I believe his name is. Please forgive me. The brain's not functioning this morning, but it's in the book. And the thing was, the manager of the Salisbury Indians had the commissioner of the minor leagues had been the coach of the manager of the Salisbury Indians. And the guy didn't want to go against him because he was his mentor and a good guy. And he said, I'm not going to fight the commissioner. He told Cambria not to fight the commissioner. They would take their lumps. And then they just continued to win and win and win. And they won the championship in 37 and in 38. But the commissioner of the league was an ex-military colonel, and he was on the straight and narrow. And they tried to convince him that the guy who was playing was not really a class man because he had been signed, had never played for the team, and never gotten a salary from the team that he signed with. And they said he was being covered up by being sent down to Salisbury. But the guy said, no. He had signed a B League contract. He was a class man. You have too many class men, and you're going to be penalized. So he got penalized. But it was a fantastic team. Excuse me. It's all in the book. I'm afraid you're going to have to buy it.
And can I ask? Is that, you might have said earlier, but I didn't register. Is that Salisbury on the Eastern Shore?
Yes.
Okay. Interesting that there was ever even a team there. That seems like something from a bygone era.
The Eastern Shore League was a pretty decent league at that time. They had 8 teams. They had 8 teams on the Eastern Shore, and Eastern Shore baseball was huge because at the time, if you're from the Washington area, there was no Bay Bridge. So
Right.
they wanted baseball so bad, they had their own league and they were very, very competitive. The only way you could see baseball was to actually take a ferry at the time and go down Route 50 all the way into Washington to see a Nationals game, or drive up Delaware to Pennsylvania and see a Phillies game. And so,
Right.
and it was, it was hard to get to baseball from the Eastern Shore. So they started their own league and they were very competitive, very, very competitive.
We're falling behind time wise. It's 10:30 and we haven't got to Cuba yet. So
in 1935, he convinces Clark Griffith. He met Griffith in 33, and they became very, very fast friends. I wasn't able to really nail it down, but his nephew, Calvin, played catcher on his bugle team for a little while. So they got to know each other. And the story is that he met Griffith in a stadium and said, I need money to keep my Hagerstown Club payroll alive. Give me some money. And they shook hands and they started a friendship agreement whereby if Cambria found somebody that was good, he'd give it to Clark Griffith for no money. And Griffith would take the guy, he'd coach him up, he'd take him and look at what he sees, and he says, all right, if I take the guy for the team, we put him on my minor league team in Chattanooga, I'll pay you some money. If not, you get nothing, you're just sending the guy back. So that's the kind of deal that they had. It was never on paper. So in 1935, he finds Roberto Estelea on the direction of Ismael Mulo Morales, who was playing for the Cuban ex-Giants, and he went to Cuba, found him and brought him to the Senators. He was on Albany for a year and then played with the Senators, got sent back down, came back up, got sent back down, came back up during the war years. So Roberto Estelea played for a long time with the Senators. But that's when he started doing it. And they turned out to be good players. Alejandro Carasel, not Chico Carasel, they weren't related. Alejandro Carasel was the first big pitcher that he found from Cuba. That's about 1936 or so. And he brought him up to the Senators, and he became a mainstay for the team, especially during the war years. Good, solid pitcher. Wasn't going to be a Cy Young Award winner or anything like that, but he was a solid pitcher who could strike people out. So when Griffith became really strapped for money after 1933, when he sold Joe Cronin to the Boston Red Sox, he told Cambria, I need to have players. So Cambria started after 33, between 33 and 35, to go to Cuba consistently. And after 35, he was there all the time and would watch the Cuban amateur leagues and really, really mine the place for talent. Nobody else was going there. Nobody else was going there. And they really didn't start paying attention until 1940, which is when the war years began, and they knew they were going to need replacement players. Not until that time did other teams like the Cincinnati Reds, the Giants, and the Dodgers started looking at Cuba in particular. And so Cambria started looking there. And not only did he start looking there, but he started looking in the Cuban basin after 1940. He found Alejandro Carasel was actually from Venezuela. And he was the first Venezuelan to play in the major leagues, the actual major leagues.
Did he find it? He didn't go to Venezuela to find him, though, right?
No,
he was playing in Cuba.
He was playing in Cuba in the Cuban amateur leagues. I think he was playing for Almendares, but I'm not sure. I have to check my facts again once again. But he was from Venezuela and playing in Cuba because there was no organized leagues in Venezuela at the time. Venezuela then did develop their own amateur league as well as Puerto Rico and the Dominican. All because of Cuba's leagues became so important, and kids were being drafted out of there by Cambria and going to America and playing American ball. So that's how important Cambria was. He really opened up the basin. Frank, could you give me a bottle of water, please? Sorry. my brother Frank's listening in to the conversation. He's up visiting for the weekend. So Cambria opened up the entire Caribbean basin with his scouting in particular. I got one great story that I'd like to tell you about. Won't kill the book for you, but in 1939, the Cincinnati Reds struck a deal with Major League Baseball, and the number 2 man under Batista, Jaime Marin was his name, Colonel Jaime Marin. He started to expand baseball in Cuba. So he struck a deal with Cincinnati that they would give Cincinnati their top 4 players, their youngest recruits from the amateur leagues, sight unseen. They would get a free tryout with Cincinnati, and they would make it onto the team. Thank you very much. Thank you. Give me a minute, if you would. Thank you. You guys are killing me here. Jess Losada was the Shirley Povich of Cuba, and Losada had spread this all over the news that these 4 guys were going to be going to Cincinnati. Major League Baseball was going to look at Cuba finally, and the whole thing. So February 1940, Cambria finds out who these kids are, where they're playing. He sneaks into the boat where they're going to sail in February for spring training to Cincinnati. He sneaks onto the boat. I'm sure he probably paid the captain some money, and he signed all 4 of the kids from underneath their noses because they had not signed a contract with Cincinnati. They had just had an agreement in kind that they would go to training, try out. Whether or not they'd make it or not, it was up to them. He signed them all 2 contracts. He gave them money, and they said they were going to play for Washington. And he took them off the boat, and he got his own boat and sailed them to Florida, where they went to training camp in up north. And Losada went ballistic. The Cuban people went ballistic. The Cincinnati Reds went ballistic, but they couldn't do anything about it because they had not signed those 4 kids to a contract. And so it became a tour de force that, Cambria was able to steal these guys out from underneath the Reds' noses without them really having any way of getting around it. And it was true. He could get around it, and he stole them away. And so they struck a deal once again saying, okay, we're going to sign these kids, and they're going to come up and they're going to play ball for us. So Joe was like that. He had his ear to the ground. He knew what everybody was doing in Cuba. Unfortunately, the 4 guys who got chosen for the Senators, none of them made it. They all had decent careers in the minor leagues, and they all played around, and then they played in the Mexican League in the 40s, and then went back to Cuba and played in the amateur leagues. So they all did very well, but they never played for the Senators themselves. So that's sort of what he did between 35 and 40, was to find as many talented Cuban players, and he brought up a lot of players at that time. So the war years hit, and this is where it really became important for him. Vernon, Yost, Cecil Travis, all of his big name players all had to go into service at the time. And so there's actually a great book that was edited by Bill Nallon on replacement players of the 1940s. And they talk a lot about the guys that played for the Washington Senators, like Jugs Fasenga and Zardone, Anthony Zardone, a real big speedster from Cuba. And they played for a couple of years while the other guys were at the front line. But Cambria started bringing busloads of these Cubans into spring training starting 1942. 1944, he had 10 Cubans signed that were on the team. They were good players, punch and Judy hitters, great speedsters on the bases, but nobody could really hit the fences because all these guys were about 5'4", 5'5", 5'6". They didn't really have a lot of power, but they were scrappy. They played well. They hustled in the whole 9 yards, and people came to see them. That's why Roberto Estrella was such a big draw for the Senators. He was hustle, hustle, go, go, bang, bang all the time, and he was a chatterbox on the base paths. And the Cubans played their own kind of ball. They took their Cuban ball from Cuba and they played it on the American League fields, and people thought it was a great gate attraction. So it worked out well for Griffith. Griffith had no money. I think you guys probably all know that. He and Connie Mack were the two original owner operators of a team that had no fortune behind them. They built all of their money up from the ground up, from ticket sales and concession sales, and by buying and selling traders and stuff of that nature. It didn't have a Wrigley candy fortune or a Jacob Rupert beer fortune or something like that. So Griffith couldn't spend any money for players. He couldn't get a Mule Haas. He couldn't get DiMaggio. He couldn't get a Greenberg, anything like that. They cost too much money. He didn't have the money. The Cuban players were incredibly cheap, and Cambria could get them by the busloads. They played very, very well, and they were competent players, but there's no superstar. There really was no superstars on the team. Nobody had any big power. There was no power hitter that they had. Mickey Vernon, when he was there, was the only real hitter that could hit and stayed to be a great hitter. It really wasn't until Irv Noren came along that they started having some pop, and then in 1954, Roy Sievers. But that's getting a little bit ahead of the game. There was no superstars on the team, but they kept coming back to see the Senators just out of loyalty more than anything else. So that's what is important to keep in mind from this book that I hope you all understand is that these Cuban players were dark. We're all very white. I'm very ruddy. I'm very white. You can see that. These guys were tan. Some of them were very tan. Clark Griffith was very cautious about how tan they could be. They had to be able to pass for white. But you have to realize that in Cuba, whiteness is a very, very different quality. And I talk about this in the book, in the back of the book. It's very important. Cubans identify on one side of the spectrum, either white or black. The problem is nobody in Cuba is white. Everybody in Cuba is black of some kind. This is according to Professor Dawn Wells at the Carnegie Mellon University, who did a fantastic book, in which I wrote about in my book, where she talks about the Cuban race identity and how they identify with themselves. And these Cuban players did not identify as being black, but they were of African blood. There's no question about it. And they say that they were of African blood of some kind. There wasn't a lot of pure Spaniards that were in Cuba. They were all intermarried in some way, shape, or form with black people. So my premise for a lot of this book, and I say it in the back of the book, is that I really think Cambria was a code breaker by bringing in these dark players way before Jackie Robinson came along in 1947. So, excuse me, it's an interesting theory, and I think it bears notice, because these guys were Roberto Estrella in 1935. He's classified as a mestizo caprio, which is like a red-haired black man. He had reddish skins, he had freckles, but he was more African American than he was Cuban. But he was light enough so that he could pass as being Cuban. And the Cubans actually did have a pretty good, didn't have as bad a time as Jackie Robinson, but they were still derided because they were tan and they were different and they weren't white. So that's another thing to take into consideration as well, about reading the book, that these guys were given the opportunity to play American baseball, but they suffered, in some instances, the same kind of degradation as Jackie Robinson did starting in 1947. So I think Cambria is not only important as a scout, but he's important as a harbinger of things to come. And I think he paved the way for Jackie to come in 1947, because people were seeing tan-skinned players play in a lot of different leagues by 1947. Cincinnati and not St. Louis. St. Louis was definitely a racist town. Cincinnati and the Giants and the Dodgers were all bringing in tan-skinned players. And they were experimenting with Cubans as well. And it's another section in the book that I have about the players the Cuban players that are playing in there. So they were used to seeing dark-skinned players.
I think maybe it should be noted that Griffith brought in Almeida and Marsans. When was that? 1912?
11? 11, when Griffith was the manager for the Cincinnati Reds, hence the reason why Cincinnati was always so very kind to the Cuban players. On the recommendation of their secretary who wintered in Cuba, he saw Almeida and Marsans, Marsans, who were playing in the Cuban leagues. Marsans was the star, but Almeida was his interpreter, and he was actually better than Marsans was. But the two of them were signed by Clark Griffith in 1911. And then 1912, Griffith moved and bought a minority stake in the Washington Senators in 12, and then fully took over the team in 1920. So he was aware of the Cubans that were there, and he was very sympathetic to their cause and knew that they could play, and they played very well. They could play at the major league level. Let's put it that way. Once again, were they superstars? No, they were very, very adequate baseball players who could run fast. They could throw, punch and Judy hitters, spray hitters to all the fields and stuff of that nature. But the majority of their talents were with the glove. They were all great glove men. That's why there were so many of them that were second basemen and were middle infield, shortstop and second baseman, because they just could cover a heck of a lot of territory. So
whose idea was it? Was it Cambria or was it Griffith to really mine the island of Cuba?
It was Cambria. Cambria tried to, as far back as 1933, convince Griffith that the African Americans were the better players and that some of the Cubans were better players and just as good at players. Because, as I said before, Cambria owned the Baltimore Black Sox from 1932 to 1934, right in the middle of the Depression. He lost his shirt. The Negro Leagues nearly folded during that time because the Depression was just so bad. They tore up contracts and guys became free agents, and they just started going anywhere they could make any money. They were playing for the gate, like if you're a musician, you're playing for the bar. It means people are leaving tips, and that's what you're playing for. So that's what they were doing. They were playing for tips pretty much between 1932 and 34. He saw all of the best black players at that time, and he tried to convince Griffith. And the Homestead Grays were playing all throughout the 1930s at Griffith Stadium when the Senators were on the road. And you know who were on the Homestead Grays? You had Satchel Paige, you brought Josh Gibson, Cool Papa Bell. The greatest players were playing right there. However, the Grays were outpacing the Senators 3-1. They were bringing in 3 times more people to Griffith Stadium on the weekends when the Senators were gone. So Griffith, he's not going to kill the cash cow. He's making a third of his money off of the Homestead Grays. If he starts taking the players from them, number one, he's going to piss off all the owners. because they don't want to integrate before the war. And number two, he's going to kill the Negro Leagues, and he's going to kill a third of his budget. And he didn't know if they were actually going to be able to keep that success when they were playing Major League Baseball. So he tried to tell him before. He had Roy Campanella and Minnie Minoso in their prime in the late 30s, early 40s, right before the war, when they were rookies, and they were fantastic. And he could have brought them up. They were black. And Griffith was not going to rock the boat. He and Connie Mack were really arch conservatives. They were straight and narrow, blinders on. They weren't going to break the color barrier. They just weren't going to try it. And then once the war started, and Sam Lacey for the Baltimore black newspaper,
Afro-American.
the Afro-American, thank you very much. Sorry, he was all over Griffith, saying, "Why are you hiring one-legged pitchers, and why are you hiring one-legged ball players to play for St. Louis when there are black players all over the place here that can play 10 times better than these guys?" And he said, "We're not going to have this battle now. We're in the middle of the war. We need to focus our things on the war and not have this conversation about, breaking up baseball and the whole 9 yards. Let's table it for later." He could have had all those players during the war years, and he probably would have had pennant-winning teams by then. As it was, because of the Cubans in 1942 and in 1945, the Senators made the first division.
So for the most part, was Cambria doing tryouts and signing amateurs, or was he signing any professionals? Tell us the story of Connie Marrero was a star in Cuba when he came later.
Yes.
And so I think that he's probably an anomaly. Most of the players that he signed were young amateurs, were they not?
Yes. Most of the great players that he signed came from the Cuban amateur leagues. You say amateur leagues. They're only amateur because of the fact that they weren't being paid. They were making money, but they were making very, very little money playing baseball in Cuba. I mean, that's the Scorpions, Almendares, the Elefantes, the Reds, all those great teams that became national heroes to the players down there. Cambria was taking those guys, and they were playing at high A ball. I mean, double A, triple A. They were playing, and after the war, of course, tons of American players were going down to Cuba and playing in the Cuban leagues because it was such good baseball that it was better than sitting around home during the winter. They'd go down there for the winter time from September through February and play winter ball down there and really get some great seasoning. Joe Black stated in his biography that he really learned to pitch in the Cuban winter leagues. And so that was hardcore baseball down there. And that's where Joe was getting most of his talent from. Now, the story on Connie Marrero is just that. He was an absolute star in the Cuban leagues and was making, great money. And so Cambria in get my notes here. In between 1946 and 50, they started the Florida International League, and he had a team from Cuba playing in Florida, and those were the Cubanos from Havana. They were called the Havana Cubans, and they called them the Cubanos. They were in Havana, but they came and they played in the Florida League, and they went back and they played in Havana, and people from the Florida League went to Havana and played there and came back. So it was actually an international league going between Florida and Cuba to play these teams. Marrero and several other great pictures for the 50s Senators, Julio Moreno, and one other, I'll get the name in a minute. They were all playing for the Cubanos. And Connie Marrero was like 24-3, 21-2, something like he was 20-game winner constantly all those years. And the Cubanos were killing the Florida International League. Nobody wanted to come see anybody but the Cubans play because they were so great. They were so fantastic. So he had 4, 5, 6 years worth of seasoning in those leagues before he was called up in 1950 and was a 40-year-old rookie in 1950. I mean, you can look it up if you're on your computer. You can look it up on Baseball Reference right now. And so he and Julio Moreno and the other Cuban player came up, and they were the three mainstays of the between 50 and 54. They were the mainstays of the Senators' battery. They were good pitchers. They didn't win because they didn't have any backup behind them. They had nobody hit home runs. Nobody could get on base other than, once again, Mickey Vernon and Eddie Yost were the only people who could get on base. Other than that, no one else could get on base. So they labored in futility. It wasn't until 54, 55, and 6 did he bring up Camilo Pascual and Pedro Ramos. And lots of other Cubans at that time. Zoyo Visales and Julio Becer and Jose Valdivieso. 1954 is when he brought up Carlos Paula. And he was the first black player to play for Washington. I'm sure you guys probably all know that. But he was not the first African-American to play for the Senators. The first African-American to play for the Senators was Joe Black from the Brooklyn Dodgers, who pitched for 1 year at the very end of his career and was absolutely killed because he had no arm and he was throwing in pain. He was throwing in absolute pain all the time. He later went on to become the first black scout for the Washington Senators. So, but Carlos Paula was the first black man to play, and that was 1954. So, as I say, it took Griffith a long time for him to change his mind about anything, including lights in baseball. Lights in baseball started as far back as 1935, and Griffith just absolutely refused to have baseball at all until the war years, until Roosevelt put out the green light letter and said, let's have night baseball. And he said, okay, fine. So then that's when he put up lights in 1941 and 42. And that's when they started having, baseball games and doubleheaders under the lights and all that kind of stuff. So,
so maybe you can segue into how the revolution impacted Cambria's ability to continue to scout. Although he died not long after, but
yeah, but not much. He was so beloved in Cuba that he had a free reign. He knew Batista, and Batista loved him to death. He knew Castro, and Castro knew him and knew of his prowess. And Joe did not get involved in politics at all. He just got involved in baseball. And so he had free reign between the revolution, starting 58, 59-ish kind of thing. The revolution didn't happen until New Year's Day, 59. Even between 59 and 60, he had no trouble signing players and getting them out of Cuba. But in 1960, that's when Castro shut the gates. That's when he went all communist and decided on, a socialist society in Cuba at the time, and said, no more, nobody's getting paid for baseball. Nobody's coming out of baseball. Nothing's going to America. We're shutting it down. The embargo happened in 1960, 1961. Eisenhower started in 1959, more so than that. But he was still able to get people out. The last person he got out was Tony Oliva. And
he was the last.
He was, as far as my research could see, he was the last Cuban he was able to get out, and he had to get out, and that was like around 1961, and he was able to get out on his brother's passport. You guys probably all know the history on that, but that's why his name is Tony. It's not really Tony. His name is Anthony. I mean, it's Roberto. And he tried to change his name, but everyone knew him by Tony, so he said as Tony Oliva. He was the last one to physically get him out and get him signed, and that was right when they split. And he was signed in '60, but didn't get there until '61, and that's when they went to Minnesota. So he actually started in Minnesota, but Cambria was the one who found him. All the other people that Cambria found were American players between 61 and 62. And like you said, Cambria got sick around 61, had to come back to America. He died in Minnesota in 1962 in October. So
You might address the apocryphal story about Castro as a prospect.
Oh, well, does everyone know that story or are familiar with it at all? Yes, no? No? Okay. Big air quotes. Supposedly, Cambria scouted him in Cuba. That's hard to do because according to several people, Peter Barkman, which everybody knows who he is. You read, and it's on the SABR website. Castro and Baseball by Peter Barkman. Read that whole thing. He debunks the whole myth. And Roberto Echeverria Gonzalez, who's a Yale University professor who wrote Baseball in Cuba, a great appendix of that. He says exactly the same thing. Castro never played any organized ball at all. The only thing that they could find was one game that he pitched for Havana when he was at the University of Havana. He lost 6-1 or something of that nature. Cambria insists that he saw him play, that he had a B-League fastball and he had a decent curve, but a lagging fastball. He had no big fastball. He'd never make it past B-League, and he never said anything about it. And so the myth was that Cambria could have signed him. And then there's another one going around that the Giants gave him a tryout before that. He never got a tryout with Washington. He never got a tryout with the Giants or the Dodgers. Nobody tried him out whatsoever. He was at school and he was involved in politics at the time. He was studying to be a lawyer. The whole thing about Don Houck, where Castro was supposed to come on the field with his people and he took over the game and he tried to pitch to Don Houck. That's all been debunked because Don Houck wasn't in Florida at the time he said that he was. That entire thing, once again, it's in my book. It's all bunk. Castro never really had the opportunity to show up and go to any tryouts whatsoever. But it's the great what if. There's a great book that I use for my research. It's called For Want of a Horse, and it's a compendium of stories about different points in history that what would have happened if something had changed, and the course of human history would have changed. And it's possible that if had he been scouted in '54, like everyone says that Cambria said that he could have come up for a tryout. Maybe he gotten into baseball. He could have gone the other way. We don't know. That's just one of those things. But you know what they say, when you have to choose between the story and the myth, print the myth. I think that's the big line. It makes for better things. Cambria was an incredibly dynamic person. How he could do all of this, what I just told you, between 1924 and 1960, or well, let's say between 1938, while still running a laundry business and running 3 baseball teams at the same time and promoting basketball, football, boxing, lacrosse, all these kinds of things. I shudder to think where he got the energy. I can't imagine where he got the energy from. The laundry business was definitely making him enough money to dabble in what he wanted to do. His wife was pretty much running the business, And I'm sure that he was probably had managers that were doing the business for him, because he really wasn't paying a lot of attention to what was going on in his laundry business, frankly.
Paul, what I think is so great about the book, what we've been talking about is all the things, all the people that all the things that Cambria did, and all the people that he signed and worked with. What I take away from the book that makes it so great is he is a hell of a quote. I mean, you must have a lot of fun digging up all the newspaper articles, because he was never shy with reporters. He was very outspoken and very colorful and the book is filled with all these just magnificent quotes. He's got a sense of humor. It's an amazing story. It was a subject that should have been a full-length book long ago. Yeah,
a movie. I got the movie rights.
Okay.
Let's make a movie. Let's get Ken Burns to do something important and write about breaking up baseball. Everybody that Cambria scouted was can't miss. I got a kid who's faster than Walter Johnson. He's faster than Bob Feller. He's faster than Ty Cobb. Oh, everybody's fast. He's great. He's a can't miss. You can't miss. That was Cambria's big thing. He's a can't miss player. And, so he was, he lived under the same thing that Brent Rickey did. He said, from quantity comes quality.
Right.
So throw as much as you can up against the wall and let's see what sticks. So like he says, it is true. I'd like to be involved in this, Ron, and find out just how many kids that he actually did sign. I mean, he signed a lot of kids that languished and played in the minor leagues, and all of the minor leagues, especially the Texas leagues. In the late 50s, they started changing their scoutings to the Texas leagues, and a lot of Cuban players went down there and played in the Texas leagues because it was close to Mexico, and they could go and play Mexican ball in the winter if they wanted to play. Plus, the Spanish language was better down in the Texas leagues than it was anyplace else. Anyway.
We're looking for some volunteers, bilingual volunteers, to help us with the Spanish language questionnaires.
Mm-hmm.
Because I suspect we'll find some additional, although those questionnaires don't always ask as directly as the post 1953 questionnaires do. Who's the scout that signed you? But you can read between the lines and oftentimes get that information in those questionnaires. But my Spanish is not good enough.
Oh.
I need some help with that.
Sure. Well, I hope I haven't gone on too long. Or if we have to stop, just let me know. But
one question here in the chat, and that is, did he scout Louis Tion?
No, I wasn't able to get a hold of him. Whoops, sorry. I actually talked to Joe Castellano in Boston. What's his name?
Castigliano.
Castiglione, excuse me. Joe Castiglione. And he gave me Louis Tion's number, and I tried to call him about that and was not able to get in touch with him. And I would have liked to have known if there had been some signings there. But Tion really didn't make it until, I don't think he came up. I'm sure that he knew his father, because his father was a star in the Cuban leagues. And but Louis Tion, the younger, really didn't make it into Boston until the 70s. And so he may have been after Cambria died. I'd have to investigate. I'm sorry that I don't know that answer.
Well, he was signed by Monchi de Arcos.
Uh-huh.
Is that a name that you ran across?
No, I'm sorry. Okay. That book behind you, if I may ask you, Ron, is that a book about Tom Greenwade? In Dodgers uniform.
Yeah, that's the Lee Lowenfish book right there.
Oh, really? That's right. Oh, no. Damn. Well, I need to buy that book.
You do need to have that book. Everybody needs that. It's probably the best book on the history of scouting since Dollar Sign on the Muscle.
I bought that book. There's a great article in there on Cambria, and I used it and quoted it in my book as well. That's a really great book, and it's another good book to read. I hope you like my book, and I hope you can pick it up. It's on Amazon and Barnes and Noble. And like I said, I did a lot of work. I did a lot of work. I had to do something while I was recovering from chemo, so that's what I did.
So Paul, what's next? You got you gonna do another bio, or are you gonna stick in the in this vein of baseball scouts, because it's a very rich vein. There's a lot of colorful characters. I think that you probably got the choice, the number one most colorful guy with the most interesting history.
Jeez.
But there's certainly plenty of others.
There is certainly plenty of others that could have gone into. A friend of mine here in the condo that we live in brought up a really fantastic idea. He worked for the Martin Marietta Company here in Baltimore, and they had professional players playing for their team during the war years. Not amateur leagues. They actually went out and bought guys who had played professional baseball, probably not household names, but I'm sort of interested in seeing that. Northrop Grumman, Martin Marietta, all of the war industry people all had these really fantastic teams with ironclad Major League Baseball players that they actually bought and had them play ball for Martin Marietta. They didn't work as an engineer, they just played ball. So I'm interested in corporate baseball at that time, to looking into that. That might be something kind of interesting. I'm going to look into it and see if it's worthy of a whole book and worthy of all my time. It's either that or I'm going to write a musical. I'm still debating on either doing another book, writing a musical, or resurrecting the Washington Baseball Historical Society. I'm considering the possibility of doing that. That's laid fallow for a couple of years since COVID.
Maybe you can combine the two subjects. Sister Rosetta Tharpe. Did she have a big crowd at Griffith Stadium?
She probably did.
Oh, you don't know the story then?
Of Sister Rosetta Tharpe?
Yes.
Well, I do know the story that Griffith Stadium was used a lot for African American.
That's where her wedding took place. It was an enormous crowd.
Oh yeah, well that's the Reverend Michaud, he was there from 1940 something to 1968 or thereabouts. The Reverend Ezekiel Marceau. I just lost it. Hang on. They had huge baptisms and wedding ceremonies. They would baptize people by the hundreds, wedding ceremonies of 50, 60 people all the time. And Clark Griffith let them use the stadium for free. So Griffith was extremely influential with the African American community in the 7th Street corridor, and in the Shaw neighborhood is where the stadium was located. He had African American groundskeepers, ticket takers, concession players, sellers. All those people he let them work in the stadium, and the African American community was there. He let them use the stadium for, as I say in the book, drill team competitions. During the war years and into the 50s, drill teams, drum and bugle corps, drill teams, majorettes, flag bearers, all that kind of stuff. They had competitions, and he would let them use it on the off days at Griffith Stadium, and free for money. and most of these were, African American teams. The original Turkey Bowl, I don't know if you're familiar with that, but there's it used to be between two high school teams, and they played on Thanksgiving Day in Griffith Stadium. Once again, free use of the stadium. So he did a lot of things for the African American community that was very positive. He wasn't Brian McKenna, who wrote the senator's book. Get to that in just a minute. He tries to paint Griffith as a racist, and I don't believe that he was. My premise is that I believe that he was just disingenuous. He was an opportunistic, and he was disingenuous. He was
extremely conservative, and the family still is.
Yes, but he was making money off of the homestead grades. He wasn't going to kill the cash cow, and as long as that money was coming in, he kept saying that the Negro Leagues need to organize better and put a better product on the team so that more people would come and see them, and white people would come to see them instead of just black people. But black people being drawn 3-1 than white people were coming to see the Negro Leagues. So he's making money off the community. Why should he stop it? And it wasn't until Jackie Robinson proved that black people could play that he brought in black people. And it wasn't until 1954, and by then most of the good players had already gone. Monty Irvin was gone, Billy Williams was gone, St. Jackie was gone. The great ones from the Negro Leagues were already with other teams. So he left it up to Cambria to find the right person. He brought up Carlos Paula, who could have been a great player, but according to Whitey Herzog, he was too busy watching birds fly in the outfield than catching baseballs. So it's an interesting conundrum. Anybody else got questions? Please bring them up. Sounds like an article for BRG, or better yet, the next 20 to 80 newsletter.
Well, that's for Bill.
Oh, for Bill. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. Sorry. Okay. So we'll see. We'll see where things are going to take me. Right now, I'm pushing the heck out of this book, and I really, honestly do appreciate it, Rob, that you brought me on to talk about this to the guys on the committee. I hope you'll spread the word around about the book. I'm very, very proud of it, and I worked really, really hard on it, and spent an awful lot of time making sure that the facts were right, the stories were right.
So you've spent maybe the last 2 or 3 years with Papa Joe. 4 years.
4 years. Yeah.
It's really easy to get wrapped up in this kind of story because it goes so many different directions.
Just so many side streets and so many ancillary stories that were going on. I just had to stop going down a lot of rabbit holes because they were getting a little bit too far outside. I think there might be a couple of things in the book that the whole saga in the 1950s where he had the Louisville Colonels, and then he tried to resurrect a team in Florida, in Clearwater, I think it was, and he tried to resurrect this team and called them the Colonels, and the back and forth between that whole thing. And it turned out to be disastrous for Cambria because he didn't have the money or the players to put on the field, and the Florida team just went practically bellied up. And it got so bad that he opened up the turnstiles and put baskets out there instead. If people want to put money in, throw money in, and anybody could come and see the games for whatever they wanted to give. And then he also lost the Louisville Colonels, which was a AA team for the Washington Senators. So that whole saga was a very interesting sort of side turn. Um, but I just found it amazing that he got so involved. And while that's going on, he's still got baseball in Cuba, and he's still got the Cuban teams that he's got to worry about. So it's just, where did he get the energy? I wish I had a tenth of his energy now.
Just FYI, when it's now 15 years ago, but when this committee was putting together, can he play? I had pressed Peter Bjorkman, please would you write the Papa Joe story?
Oh,
It was, he knew that that 1,500 words or 3,000 words wouldn't begin to tell the story. And so I appreciate the fact that you finally made a full-length book of it, because it is a fascinating life.
it was
Unique in all of baseball or American history. It's truly one that deserves a lot more visibility.
I hope so. If from your lips to everyone's ears, get the book and push it to your friends. I like the idea. The last meeting that we were on with Lee Lowenfish, the last talk that we just had, the idea that the scouts are the backbone of the industry, and I liked that quote, and I like what you said, and I absolutely believe that. I think that this is a fertile time for us. We need maybe shine the light on some of these scouts. I mean, they're the ones who are bringing to the attention of the general managers and the field managers where these players are and what they're doing. And so they're too busy with the team of the day. They need to rely on the scouts to bring them, the proper reports. And to this day, it's still a what if. It's still a crapshoot no matter which way you go. You can have the greatest kid in the world, Jackson Holiday for the Baltimore Orioles. We're all praying that he's going to be a five-tool player like his father was. What happens when he comes up here and he sees the Jacob deGroms and the Scherzers and the people like that? What's going to happen when he sees fastballs and curveballs that are all over the place? He may look great on paper in Single A in Aberdeen and the Ironbirds and the Shorebirds, but what's going to happen when he comes up here? It's like just like Cambria. You can't miss. And he comes up here and he misses. We'll see what happens. I don't think he will. I'm praying to God that he doesn't. Baltimore could use a big hitter like that with what we've got now.
Oh my God.
We got Santander and we've got Rushman and Moncastle, and guys are popping the ball over the fence. So it's fun to be an Orioles fan. We're going to the game today, as a matter of fact. So that's where we're going. So we're gonna have fun. Thank you very much. I appreciate you having me here. Anybody else got questions, please?
Well, I want to say thanks for everybody for sticking around, and we had a couple technical difficulties at the beginning. We'll do better next time. In the meantime, I hope to see some of you in Chicago, all of you in Chicago, if at all possible. It's going to be a great time. That's a fantastic hotel, and it's just a big event.
Speaking of somebody who can find talent, there's Bill Nowlin, who found.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. Sorry, I missed the first section there, but
here's
inspiring. Thank you.
Here's a guy who found one of the best blues bands, the Nighthawks, and signed him to his record label. My friend Jan Zukowski, who sent his regards, by the way. I just talked to him a few days ago, and
cool.
He can find good talent. He knows good talent when he sees it. I hope you enjoy the book, and God, I had fun, right? It was fun. It was just a lot of fun to get into it. The nuts and bolts were not fun. It's kind of like my teaching career. I loved to teach my kids when I was teaching strings at the Landon School, but I hated the administrivia and all the crap that goes along with teaching. But It's kind of the same thing with the book, you know. I wish I
Well,
could just write.
kudos to McFarlane for investing in the editing, because they don't do that with every book, with every story. And his story, I guess that Gary recognized how important it was. And because you're saying 5 rounds of editing and your own guy,
my own guy
it
plus 4 other
shows
ones.
it's really well written and it flows really well.
Yeah. Gary edited and sent me editings. I had a peer review editor whom I don't know who it was because he never tells me who it is. And then my guy edited it. And then the final, I had one final editor before they actually put it up on the board and got it out. So 4 or 5 times.
Well, the first thing that I did is I wanted to check my list against yours, and I didn't find any errors.
Thank you.
I mean, some obscure things. Oh, well, he shared credit with this guy so I might have had a name or two that you didn't have, and then you had some that I didn't have, but it all checked out.
I appreciate that. I really do. I mean, I really.
But if he signed 400 players, we got a whole lot more names to flush out.
Well, yeah,
so
I mean,
that would be fun.
There's only 50, 60 some that actually, I mean, you saw the list of the players that he signed who actually played ball for the Washington Senators. And maybe, well, Willie Miranda, who went to Baltimore, but he was signed by Cambria. But, there were more of them that were signed by him. Like I say, probably didn't make it up to the bigs, but they played AA, AAA ball. A lot of them played for Charlotte or Chattanooga and had great careers playing in minor league ball. That was a great thing to talk about. Anthony Zardone, who was a replacement player for the Senators during the war years, he played until he was nearly 50 years old, playing in the Mexican leagues and the Cuban leagues. So the great thing about Cambria that I want to impress upon everybody is that every single player that I talked to, that I interviewed with Pascual, Ramos, Julio Becerra, Jose Valdivieso, all of the Cuban players said exactly the same thing. There should be a shrine to Cambria. Nobody was giving Cuban ball players a chance to play baseball. None of them. Only Joe Cambria was giving them the break. They were giving him the opportunity. He gave him the money, go up there, and you either make it or you don't. He wasn't guaranteeing them anyone. He was just guaranteeing them, I'll pay you X amount of money, play for a week. You have to make the team. Maybe it was kind of bad because he didn't explain how hard it was, how difficult it was. Plus they had the racial thing they had to go through and a language barrier to go through. So in some cases, it was difficult for those players to try and make it. The ones who made it were the ones who were good. Connie Marrero, Jose Moreno, Julio Becerra, Valdivieso, a lot of the guys in the 40s.
So we didn't mention one other he's got 2 Hall of Famers.
Yes, he does.
Besides Oliva, who just got in, but
Early Wynn walked into the Bradenton, Florida camp as a 17-year-old kid and a tryout, and just showed him what the fastball looked like. And Cambria had to go to his mother and convince the mother that this would pay for his school, for his college, and wouldn't do anything. And the mother had to sign off on him on joining the team. And so
who in the wide world of sports is Alabama Pitts? There's a story. Very colorful player.
Okay.
He's got a SABR bio, by the way.
Does he really?
Yes.
That's right. That's right. He does. I've looked at it. Of course, that's how I found out he got stabbed. When Cambria owned the Albany team, he really became a Bill Veeck. He installed lights way before Major League Baseball had lights, and he tried to get as many colorful players as he could. The first one he got was actually Bullet Bob Benson, who played for the House of David team,
Oh, that was a good story.
And he had a beard, chin whiskers, mattress chin, butter whiskers, all kinds of being hurled in the whole 9 yards. He signed him to a Washington contract, and the guy could play pretty well, but he was just derided so badly because he had whiskers. He had whiskers that were about as my goatee is longer than his whiskers were. Okay, I'm telling you, my goatee is longer than the whole beard that he had, and so they thought he was a circus act. They said he was a freak. Nobody had a beard back at that time. He didn't do well, and he only lasted a couple of years for the Senators. Got sent down, and then he went back to his farm in Idaho. The next guy he got was Alabama Pitts. Pitts was a convict from Sing Sing. He had run afoul of the law. He got put away for 5 years, was a fantastic hitter up in Sing Sing. He came to Washington and stunk. But not before there was this huge controversy. Griffith wanted to give him a second chance. He plays baseball. We're going to give him a chance to rehabilitate his life in the whole 9 yards. People saying you're not going to have ex-cons and murderers now on baseball teams, all this kind of stuff. Huge controversy all over the world. Judge Landis got into the fray. The minor league baseball, Charles Broutman, he got into the fray, and they all said, let him play. Okay, but not exhibition games. He plays real games because he wasn't going to have him make money off of him as a circus freak. So Pitts came and he tried to play. He did pretty well, but not well enough to stick. So he didn't actually make it. The other guy that he hired was Frank Shanty Hogan. Shanty Hogan was about 5'1". He says it was 230. He was more 260, maybe 270 than he was 230. And he had a very bad problem. He was a switch eater. He could eat with both hands, probably at the same time. And Casey Singles, as he ate more than any two other kids that he'd ever seen before in his life. At the training camp when he was with the Giants with John McGraw, he had a specialized hand signal for the waitress who came to the team dining room all the time. And he'd give 2 fingers if he wanted pork chops, or he'd go like this if he wanted bread. If he went like this and like this, he wanted bread and butter. And so he ate himself out of baseball. He was absolutely huge. They couldn't find equipment to fit him. He was too fat for a catcher. I mean, he had a great back, but he couldn't run for a damn. The other thing he tried to do in 1936 was he tried to hire Babe Ruth to be the manager of the Albany Senators. The story goes that Ruth was going to try out to be the manager for the Albany Senators, and if he did that for a year, then Clark Griffith was going to let him manage the Washington Senators in 1937. But Ruth decided to turn him down. So that's who Alabama Pitts was. Cambria was trying to find anybody that he could. Once again, if he could have found black baseball players to play, he would have done so. So,
well, it's 11:30. That's 90 minutes. I really appreciate everybody sticking around. We'll do this again. Okay, there's a bunch more books that I've got a list for, but next, first things first, we've got a convention, and then we'll see about another Zoom meeting in the fall.
Okay. Oh, somebody put up the list in the chat room.
That's what I just posted.
Oh, you just did? Way to go.
As we were talking about Alabama Pitts.
Oh, there he was. Thanks very much, everyone. I appreciate it. Have a good, a safe weekend and Memorial Day. And I appreciate being in the chat room. And Jeff, thanks for being so calm and collected. And I hope you buy the book.
Well, thank you.
Absolutely.
I enjoyed it.
Thank you very much. Thanks again, Bill Now. Thanks, everyone. I'm going to take my leave. We're getting ready to go to the ball game, so we're going to take off. Thank you, Rod. We'll be in touch, okay?
You bet.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for everything.
Thank you much. Bye-bye.